Howdy folks, it's about 6:30 in the morning and I am driving to Canggu right now to go continue working on one of these domes we're building. And today I'm going to talk about what I consider to be one of the most misunderstood topics in the nutritional world. And this topic, it affects us all. It doesn't matter if you're keto, carno, junk food vegan, whole food plant-based vegan, it doesn't matter. We all share a very similar anatomy, and I know that we all have slight differences based upon our composition, based upon our genetic strengths and weaknesses, and even more controversially perhaps our astrology and that sort of thing. However, we do share a very similar anatomy and physiology, and I, from my perspective, think that we have very similar nutritional needs. The topic I want to talk about is something called insulin resistance, and I want to describe what that is. Insulin resistance versus insulin sensitivity. I want to describe what that is and how it relates to type 2 diabetes, how it relates to type 1 diabetes, and how it relates to the overall well-being of the individual. So, insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is defined as one's desensitivity to the hormone called insulin, and the amount of insulin that is required to get glucose into the cells. If you're more insulin resistant, you're going to require more insulin to get the same amount of glucose in the cells as if you are insulin sensitive, where you will use less and require less insulin to get this glucose into the cells. So, what causes insulin resistance? Well, this gets into one of the aspect that's a bit controversial, and it's not so controversial anymore. It's just very highly misunderstood. People have a big misunderstanding of type 2 diabetes because of old data that correlated intake of sugar with diabetes. So what they correlated was, as you increase sugar intake, and they even corresponded fruit and everything, which is one of the most healthy foods on the planet and one of the most perfect types of sugar, fructose, for us to digest. They correlated with higher sugar intake with type 2 diabetes. However, that data is old, and is now, the new data tells us that fat is actually more of the culprit. And the way that this works is the cells have what's called a receptor site. This is basically a keyhole. And the key for this receptor site is a hormone called insulin. And in order for the cell to open the doors to allow glucose into the cells, insulin must be present to insert into that receptor site and unlock the door to bring in the glucose. And what happens when you take in too much fat in the diet, you have this free fat in the blood, is the sticky, lipidy fat clogs up these keyholes, clogs up these insulin receptor sites, making it to where the insulin cannot actually unlock the cell to bring in glucose. So this is what it looks like. Let's say, for example, you eat a bunch of peanut butter. You eat a bunch of peanut butter, and then right after that, you decide you're gonna eat a bunch of fruit or something like that. Or actually, fruit requires very little insulin, so that's not a great example. You drink a bottle of Coke or something. Tons of sucrose, sugar that wants to get into the cells. Well, what you've done whenever you ate all that peanut butter is you put all this free fat into the blood, and those insulin receptor sites get clogged by this free fat. And so now you drink this Coca-Cola, you've got all this sugar that's flooding into the blood because it's refined sugar. You're already getting a sugar spike because of this. There's no slow release aspect to these refined sugars. They just dump into the blood, go into your stomach, and basically start absorbing straight into the bloodstream very quickly. So now you've got all this sugar in the blood, and the body recognizes this, sends out some biochemicals to trigger the pancreas to start producing insulin to go unlock the cells so that this sugar can get into the cells and can be converted to ATP, energy for the body. Well, what happens is now you've got your receptor sites all clogged with all this fat. The body triggers the pancreas to release insulin. The insulin goes to the receptor site trying to open the cells, and unfortunately it's blocked. It's sticky and blocked with this fat, and so it just continues to bounce off. And what the body recognizes is, hey, we still got high blood sugar. You know, this is an issue. It's raising the pH of the blood. We got to get this insulin, this sugar into the cells. Not raising the pH, actually lowering the pH, becoming more acidic. And so it triggers it sends out these same biochemicals, says still glucose in the blood, produce more insulin. So the pancreas continues to produce more insulin, more insulin, more insulin, until the pancreas actually at some point reaches exhaustion. So this is called pancreatic exhaustion, also known as type 2 diabetes. So now you've worn out your pancreas. It's not able to produce sufficient amounts of insulin to get glucose into the blood, glucose into the cells. And you have to start, usually with type 2 diabetes, you have to start taking some sort of oral insulin supplement. And all this is due to high insulin resistance. Your cells are, your body is resistant to the insulin that's being produced by the pancreas due to the clogging of the receptor sites by fats. So that's a very different worldview than we have with the previous, where it's just you take in more sugar and you get type 2 diabetes because you're having to produce more and more insulin. This is not true, because in the absence of fat, or let's say in the absence of excess fat, in a balanced fat diet, your body becomes extremely sensitive to insulin, and you require fractions of the amount of insulin to get the same amount of glucose into the cells. So how does this apply to? And let me put this tidbit in there. People with type 2 diabetes are easily cured of type 2 diabetes by transitioning to a whole foods plant-based diet with moderate fat. It doesn't even have to be super low fat. It just needs to be below the 20% range. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little while. People are being cured of type 2 diabetes by doing 5 to 10 day water fasts, because what's it do? It goes ahead and your body processes all the free fats in the blood. Your pancreas gets a nice rest from having to produce all this insulin, and then all of a sudden you go back off the fast, you put some carbohydrates into the diet, and boom, your pancreas is producing at a normal, or at least a semi-restored rate, and you become very insulin sensitive, and boom, you're cured of type 2 diabetes. How does this apply to type 1 diabetes? Well, type 1 diabetes is where the B cells in the pancreas have actually become all or most incapable of producing insulin. It's called endogenous insulin produced within the body, in order to get the sugars into the cells. Well, what's been found is that if a person follows a whole food plant-based diet, reduces their fat spread out throughout the day to around 15 to 20%, and this is important, spreading it out through the day, because with the example before, you eat a ton of peanut butter and then you eat a bunch of apples, well, you're going to have the effect of having fatty blood right there in that moment. But if you spread your fat out throughout the day to the 15-20% range, and you're reducing the amount of refined foods as much as possible, refined sugars, refined flours and things, because these things dump sugar into the blood, causing a big spike. These big spikes can cause excess insulin production, that sort of thing. Then what they find is that people with type 1 diabetes can reduce their insulin, their exogenous, out of the body, insulin supplementation by up to 80%. And in some rare cases where type 1 diabetes patients have some B cell function, meaning they're able to produce a little bit of insulin, they can get down to almost no exogenous insulin requirement. So, how does this affect a normal healthy person? Well, what we learn is that, the most sensitive demographic, nutritional demographic, which I would say is a type 1 diabetic, who requires this exogenous insulin in order to survive, is around 15, some even say 10% fat, 15 to 20% fat. Someone who has a more healthy digestive function, who has a healthy pancreas and stuff, we can use this as an example for what is optimal, but we have a little bit more flexibility. And so I like to say, and I've found what's a good balance for myself where I'm able to enjoy exceptional health and not have to restrict calories or restrict food and this sort of thing, is to shoot for around the 20% range of fat. And so what's this look like? It looks like about, let's say 60 to 70% carbohydrates, 10 to 15, maybe 20% protein. I'm probably in the 10 to 15% range max. And then 15 to 20% fat, with exception of, like, say you go out to eat, you eat a little bit more fat one day, it's not going to kill you if you get 25-30% fat every once in a while. The standard American diet is going to be 35% fat or more, and then you get into carno keto, you're just looking at like ridiculous amounts of fat. And so any amount of carbohydrates that are brought in is going to cause strain on the pancreas because of the insulin requirements. So that's getting into another topic, but I think that long-term, anybody on carno keto is going to suffer some long-term negative effects from this insulin resistance, not to mention deterioration of the cell of the arterial walls, which is shown by the research of Rip Esselstyn, or Dr. Why can't I remember his name? His son's Rip Esselstyn, but we'll just say Dr. Esselstyn right now, which is one of the plant-based doctor heroes who has the highest success rate at reversing heart disease on the planet. So what is the experience of a healthy person in the face of insulin resistance? Say you're taking in too much fat. Well, you're naturally, if you're not able to get the glucose into the cells, you're going to feel more sluggish. You're going to feel more tired. You're going to have the feeling of a slightly more acidic body. If you've been paying attention to this kind of thing for some time, you can actually recognize these sorts of sensations of slightly more acidic blood, which there's only like 0.3 pH that you can be between before you're dead in either direction, too alkaline or too acid. What you'll notice is as you go into the slightly lower side of the pH, I think it's in the 7.3 to 7.7 range, that's 4.4 pH, you'll notice that you have a slightly stickier, kind of sour, nasty taste in the mouth. Maybe your eyes burn a little bit more. You feel a little bit more tired, sluggish, fatigue, just that lesser sense of well-being. And this is where, when you're in slightly more acidic pH all the time, you'll have a higher tendency towards catching colds, towards like we were saying, chronic fatigue, towards parasitic conditions, different things like that. So the other thing that I wanted to say, and then in the opposite, if you're insulin sensitive, you're just going to feel really good after you eat food, because you're energized quickly and easily by the ease of getting those carbohydrates into the cells without a huge strain on the pancreas to produce lots of insulin. Last thing is, I want to cite where I learned a lot of this information on insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance. It's a book called Mastering Diabetes by Cyrus Kambata and Robbie Barbaro, if I said that right. And it's just an amazing book for learning about specifically type 1, type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, and how one can reduce their insulin requirements drastically by transitioning to a whole foods plant-based diet at around 15% fat and minimal refined carbohydrates, minimal refined foods. But it's also just an amazing compilation of research on whole foods plant-based nutrition, and contrasts it with the vast amount of nutritional information out there, and just shows the reality of low carb diets, high carb diets, omnivorous diets, vegan diets, yada yada yada. It's an amazing contrast, and it's really cool to get to see somebody lay that out. It cites over 800 and something studies in the book alone. So I highly recommend reading that book if you're long-term whole food plant-based, if you're new, if you're thinking about transitioning. It's just an amazing compilation of information on the topic. Yeah, and you can actually listen to it on Audible, which is really convenient. So that's my talk today on insulin sensitivity versus insulin resistance, how that applies to type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetes, and relatively healthy individuals. So I hope you enjoyed this. It's kind of a long one, but it's a big topic, and I hope this brought some clarity to this topic of how humans process carbohydrates in the face of fats. So I hope this also influences your nutritional decisions, and that with this foundation of understanding, you'll be able to experientially feel the difference of insulin sensitivity versus insulin resistance when you experiment with different food combinations. So experience is key. All right, as always, wishing you the best of health. Woo woo!